Thank you all for joining us at Morgan Franklin Fellowship in our Lunch and Learn webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about who's who in the world of accounting. I'd like to welcome Jessica Boulerice, a certified management accountant, or a CMA for short. She's a financial strategist and founder of Sterling House Advisors. My name is Judy Window, and I'm the executive director of Morgan Franklin Fellowship. And I've been lucky enough to work with Jessica on several projects throughout various different business ventures that Jessica and I are both participating in. Jessica will introduce us to a wide variety of professionals who record, analyze, and maintain financial accounts and statements. Whether you're here to explore a career in financial reporting industry, or if you're here as a business owner looking to find out what types of financial reporting professionals your organization might need, you've come to the right place. Jessica earned her undergraduate degree in economics from the University of New Hampshire, and then earned her MBA in finance from Southern New Hampshire University. We're delighted that she's with us here today. Before I turn the program over to Jessica, I'd like to share a few words about Morgan Franklin Fellowship. At Morgan Franklin Fellowship, or MFF, we believe in talking about, what do we believe? We believe in learning how to talk about money. We also believe in understanding how money works in the real world is an important first step for you to learn about your financial goals. We believe everybody should have the opportunity to be financially independent. And at the end of today's program, we'll share a little bit more about our organization. But for now, let me please welcome Jessica.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Judy, for having me today. As Judy mentioned, I am a CMA, so we're going to talk a little bit about that designation later on, but I wanted to just add a little bit to Judy's introduction about sort of where I got where I am today and why this topic that we're going to cover today is so interesting to me and how it's sort of impacted my career and really sort of the lack of understanding that most people have surrounding the various accounting and finance positions that are out there, has impacted me in a good way, but I think it can be sort of frustrating and challenging for both people looking to start a career in finance or accounting, and also to small business owners. I hear that frequently from companies that I work with. I need a finance person. And it's really not that sort of simple of a process. What kind of finance person do you need? What are you looking for them to do? And very importantly, also, what is your budget as a small business owner? So to sort of start from the beginning, I became interested in accounting in high school, actually. I worked as an accounting clerk for the company that both my mom and my aunt worked for, and they were both also in the accounting department. So that's when it sort of occurred to me, hey, you know what? I've always really enjoyed math. That is something that I excel at. So why don't I sort of explore that as an opportunity in college? So as Judy mentioned, I went to school for economics at the University of New Hampshire. As part of that economics sort of broader curriculum, accounting classes are sort of obviously a part of that. But honestly, throughout college, I thought, the only real path for an accountant is to become a CPA, right? I think that's a pretty common sort of misconception that people hold. And honestly, that didn't interest me that much. I really wasn't interested in doing people's taxes, and I thought that's sort of all that accountants did. So, aside from, again, being the accounting clerk that I was in high school, but, you don't necessarily need a college degree for that. So after I graduated, there weren't a lot of jobs for economists that were entry level. So I went to work for Investors Bank and Trust, which is in Boston, or was in Boston. They were acquired by State Street Bank, which I think everybody has probably heard of at this point. But my roles that I held there always had accountant in the title. So maybe it was fund accountant or junior accountant or, so on. And I didn't need a CPA to do those jobs. So I thought, this is interesting. This sort of goes against everything I've ever known. So, after working for them, I started applying for different staff accounting roles at various other companies. So it really opened my eyes to the fact that there are a million other things that accounting and finance students can do with their careers. So I've worked for small businesses, medium, large, multinational, financial services, insurance, bottled water, transportation. Sort of runs the whole gamut, which does make the accounting and finance career path very interesting for people. So um, I've held almost every role that we'll talk about today, but most of my training in accounting has been on the job. So, I now hold some accounting specific designations, uh, but when I earned my MBA, my focus was on finance because I had so much on the job experience in accounting. I sort of wanted to round out that experience and knowledge and add some more finance related information to my skill set. I started my own company in 2017. I offer fractional accounting and finance services, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because from the perspective of a small business owner, that's typically much more affordable than hiring a full-time controller or whatever it is. So they're becoming super popular. And really the reason that we chose this topic with Morgan Franklin Fellowship today is because, the lack of clarity surrounding this topic, while it served me well, as I mentioned, you know, again, it's something that can really, I think, attract people into the finance and accounting field if they realize that there's more to do than just taxes, or, more to do than be a bookkeeper. So today we're going to talk about 10 different accounting roles, and sort of how they compare and contrast with each other. We're going to talk about what it means as a student to choose one of these career paths and what your skill set should be. We're going to talk about what these roles are from the perspective of the small business owner. And, you definitely don't need all 10, probably. As a small business owner, you may be able to find one person that can cover, all of these roles, or maybe you just have two or three. And we're also going to talk about, again, just sort of the pay ranges or the cost for each of these roles, so that everyone can sort of have a good idea of what they are getting into. So, why is this topic so confusing? You would think it would be pretty straightforward, but of course it is not. So, of these 10 roles that we're going to talk about, there's a ton of overlap between them. So, you might have a controller that serves the role of the staff accountant, a staff accountant that sort of does what a bookkeeper does. You've got a CFO that does, everything from start to finish. It all depends on the size of the business. So really only a very large corporation would have, let's say, all 10 of these roles that we're going to discuss today. Quote unquote, finance and accounting, it's very big. And again, there's a lot of overlap even in the disciplines themselves. I think, it's important to know what, those overlaps are, and sort of what the base of each finance, quote unquote, and accounting do. So, for example, if you're a financial analyst and you have sort of a base knowledge in accounting, then that's going to help you do your job more successfully, because you're so intertwined with that accounting department. But there's very little sort of standardization in what we call these things. So, a staff accountant at one company might be an accounting clerk at another company. A controller at one company might be called a treasurer at another. It's all very confusing and not helpful. So, the most well-known accounting professional titles are probably bookkeepers, CPAs, and CFOs. Why are those the ones that everybody knows about? Who knows? I think it's probably because bookkeepers are the most common. Every business should have a bookkeeper, or needs a bookkeeper, at the bare minimum. CPAs and CFOs, I think, there's some prestige that is associated with having that C sort of title, whether it be chartered or certified or chief. Those are things that sort of take a lot of education and experience to earn. So they're things that people aspire to. Um, so, because of that confusion, it I think is important for young professionals to sort of vary their skill sets. So, working for some larger companies can be a great way to do that, because you can sort of move from department to department or position to position, try out a bunch of these without going through, the inevitable hassle and stress of changing companies completely, and going through the interview process and all of that. In my career, I found it extremely helpful, to be able to work for those large companies and get a taste of what these various roles are. um, so you know that's sort of why we're here today, just to say, if we have this base level of knowledge of what these different roles do, we can sort of cater it to suit our own preferences, whether it be in our career or as a business owner. um, you know as I mentioned before, we'll talk a little bit about fractional service companies. So this is probably an appropriate time to do that. So, as I mentioned, a small business owner is thinking, how on earth could I afford 10 different accounting and finance professionals? I don't even have probably 10 employees total. And that is a great question. So, fractional management and service companies have become super popular over the past, probably 5-ish years. And they don't necessarily need to offer accounting and finance services. Sometimes they offer HR. Sometimes they offer operations. But they offer a lot of flexibility for small and medium sized business owners. So it sort of becomes a, pay for only what you need. And I think that's a commercial that is currently airing very regularly for Liberty Mutual right now. But it's that's sort of the premise of these fractional services companies. Maybe you need a controller, but you only need them for 10 hours a week or 10 hours a month. So that's sort of what those businesses offer. So I'm definitely happy to take questions, on those later on at the end during the Q&A session. And actually, if people have questions as we go along, feel free to shout them out. I don't mind being interrupted, and sometimes it's more relevant that way. Um, so really, the reason that we thought that this topic was so important, not only just to add clarity, but if you're trying to decide on a career path, or if you're a business owner, you really need to ask detailed questions about what the position entails in terms of daily tasks, and also what a candidate's experience level is. You definitely cannot just base your assumptions on somebody's title on their resume. So, let's say somebody has staff accountant on their resume, you cannot assume, if you're hiring them, that they worked on specific things. It's so vague. So, that's just sort of the message that we want to get across mostly, is to ask detailed questions, know what you're interested in. Um, you know, these types of roles that are very sort of vague, and ambiguous are not, exclusive to accounting and finance. Engineers are a good example. There's mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, industrial engineers, civil engineers. The list goes on and on. So, it's pretty common, uh, for this sort of ambiguity. The good news is, let me just change slides here. The good news is that there are some universal qualities that would be expected of any of these roles, right? So obviously, general math skills. if you are not a math person and you hate math, I definitely do not recommend that you get into accounting or finance. Although, because Morgan Franklin Fellowship's curriculum is based on money, I would assume that most fellows have an interest in math. Um, you know, attention to detail, critical thinking, analytical skills, super, super important in any accounting or finance role. Uh, a lot of companies are running short staffed, especially now with the pandemic that we've been experiencing. So there can be a lot of errors that are made. Even in your personal life, you may have noticed that there's an error on your credit card statement one month or on your bank statement. Maybe your direct deposit didn't go through one week. There's a lot of human error that can go on in accounting and finance. So having that attention to detail and those analytical skills will really go far in identifying those errors that may come up and being able to fix them proactively before they become catastrophic. Um, Ability to learn new software quickly, super important. So, QuickBooks is something that we'll mention a couple times throughout the lunch and learn today. That's literally only because it happens to be the most popular software to be used by small and medium-sized business. Um, a lot of large corporations have their own internal software that is built specifically for them. So you definitely have to have that skill set where you're able to learn these various softwares um, and be able to do so relatively quickly, because if you do change employers throughout your career, you're going to have to learn a new software probably every time. Sometimes in ads they'll say, oh, okay, well, we really want somebody that has Sage experience or SAP or whatever it is. And honestly, it's that learning curve that prompts people to sort of put those requirements into their job advertisements. Uh, Organization and time management, also super important, especially in accounting, because everything is deadline driven. So, you have a month end close, a quarter end close, a year end close. We have tax deadlines that we need to meet. We have reporting deadlines, especially in public companies. If you follow the stock market at all, public companies announce their results on a regular basis. So, God forbid the financials were not ready by the time you have your investor call. That would be very bad. So the time management and organization are a huge, huge requirement for being successful in these roles. And then lastly, it's really just, general business knowledge. What makes a business successful and profitable? Um, just sort of knowing you can't spend more money than you bring in. Very basic. But of course, if you're going to go to school for accounting or finance, there will be general business courses that you'll have to take. So with that, we will jump into our discussion of the various roles. And we will start with bookkeeper, and we'll work our way up to CFO. So bookkeepers and staff accountants, they can be pretty similar. So I think, really the biggest difference is the education requirement and also sort of the type of companies that they might work for. So a bookkeeper does not have any degree requirement. They, however, can take certification courses. So, again, QuickBooks, a great example. They have sort of a whole QuickBooks university that you can go to, to learn about how to start your own bookkeeping business. How do we use QuickBooks? What are sort of the basic reporting functionalities and things like that. So there are a lot of certificates that can be earned regarding bookkeeping. They cover a super wide range of duties, sort of soup to nuts, accounts payable, accounts receivable, There's just, basic data entry, bank reconciliations. They can handle payroll if you don't use a payroll company. I mean, but then again, even if you do use a payroll company, someone's got to give them the data. So there's really no limits to what a bookkeeper can be responsible for. Many small business owners perform bookkeeping duties themselves, which is not recommended, despite how common it is. And the reason that I don't recommend that primarily is because business owners should really, or everyone should really sort of stick to what their skill set is. So let's say you own a restaurant and you're a chef. You don't want to spend your time trying to figure out how to do bookkeeping. You should be focusing on doing what you're good at and, growth and operations. And it's going to be way faster for someone who has bookkeeping experience to perform those duties than someone who doesn't, right? So the owner might spend 6 hours a week slogging through various bookkeeping tasks, but a bookkeeper could maybe accomplish that in an hour and a half, and then that frees up the owner to spend that 6 hours doing what they do best, which is running their business. So honestly, that's the biggest reason. A lot of times people, when they're starting out, just don't want to spend the money, which is also understandable. But bookkeepers can be found for a pretty reasonable price these days. So if you are a small business owner that doesn't have a bookkeeper right now, I would encourage you to do like a Google search of local bookkeepers and just sort of explore it. And I think you would not regret it. The real differences between the bookkeeper and the staff accountant, like I mentioned, are mostly education levels. So a staff accountant would typically be a role that you would find at a larger company. Maybe not super large, but it's very common among, publicly traded companies and things to have a whole team of, 20 staff accountants or whatever it is. Um, they typically require at least a bachelor's degree. Doesn't necessarily have to be in accounting, could be in another finance related discipline. But similar to a bookkeeper, a staff accountant would be or could be rather responsible for any duty. It could be general ledger, bank reconciliations, payroll, all of the same things. But because of that education requirement, and especially if you're like a general ledger staff accountant, you would definitely be expected to have that working knowledge of the technical accounting. So debits and credits and all those things, where if you're using QuickBooks as a small business owner, you typically don't really need to know that, because QuickBooks automates that for you. And then, at the end of the year, you send some reports to your CPA and they make adjustments as necessary. So the median pay, and this is, across the US, so there's clearly going to be some variation. A staff accountant in San Francisco is very likely to make more than a staff accountant in Manchester, New Hampshire. That makes sense. So these median salaries that I'll be sharing with everybody are based on, nationwide medians, and they're mostly entry level. So an entry level bookkeeper would average around $45,000 a year in salary, or cost if you're looking at it from that perspective. And then a staff accountant would be more around like 55,000 for a starting salary, due to those additional education requirements. So next we will discuss investment and cost accountants. So these are two of the roles that I haven't held on this list. So honestly, a big part of that is just how specialized they are and how specialized the education required is for both of these roles. So an investment accountant would be good for a company really that just holds a ton of assets. So I say a ton of assets, it could be real estate or investment holdings versus, again, let's say you own a cleaning company. Chances are, you have your cash account and maybe you have a money market account, but, you're not investing the company's money in stocks or, things like that. So an investment accountant would typically work for an investment bank, a hedge fund, a brokerage, insurance companies. So, insurance companies are required to hold really, really massive cash reserves that they invest in, various bonds and stocks and things like that. A real estate development company might need an investment accountant. Um, so it's super, super specialized, and because of that, typically, the median starting salary for an investment accountant would be, about $10,000 higher than a general staff accountant, so about 65,000. Um, that starting salary would be about the same for an entry level cost accountant, and cost accountants sort of they have the same level of complexity in what they do every day. There are, oh my gosh, so many different types of cost accounting you can use. And these people are going to work for companies that are manufacturing or retail, maybe consulting for either of those industries, people that hold inventory. So, accounting for inventory can be very complex, and especially as it relates to the generally accepted accounting principles, or if you're a multinational, the IFRS rules. Super duper complex about how do we use first in, first out inventory? Do we use last in, last out inventory? It's pretty crazy. The CMA designation, has a big chunk of their curriculum based on cost accounting, and it is pretty mind blowing the amount of specialization they have to have. So again, that is, something that you may just stumble into throughout your career. Maybe you work for a retail company in their corporate office, so you would sort of naturally be exposed to this cost accounting, or maybe you go to school for it. Either way, I think investment accounting probably, people sort of decide this is what I want my career to be. And cost accounting, it's probably through experience more than anything. If you're choosing that as a career path, probably either type of, you know, these companies are not going to be small to medium size. They're generally going to be pretty large. So next up, we will talk about financial analysts. So financial analyst falls more under that, quote unquote, finance umbrella. What they're doing is they're sort of the second uh, step in the process where they take the data and the financial reports that accountants put together, and they analyze it and interpret it for management and the executive team. Typically, a financial analyst would be responsible for budgeting or forecasting, also long-term strategy of the company. If you are considering going into financial analysis as a career, there's lots of graphs and presentations. Definitely not a role that you want if you are not a public speaker or, very much dislike public speaking. Financial analysis may not be for you, at least once you sort of move up the path into, management roles. Um, but yeah, you need to have a strong understanding of how accounting impacts the results that you're looking at, and also a strong understanding of where the business is going and what the business model is. Um, a lot of controllers, which we'll talk about next, have experience in financial analysis, so they may, instead of there being an accounting department that then passes data on to the finance department to analyze, it may sort of all be done within one department, if you will. So like an accounting manager at a small business may be the one that produces the P&L every month and also meets with the owner to put together a budget. The pay range, or the median pay rather, for a financial analyst starting is around $60,000. So, you know, if you can find someone as a small business owner that has experience in both and can sort of cover both those bases, it might make more sense versus having two full-time people to perform those duties. So one final note on financial analysts. So there is a designation that can be earned by financial analysts called the CFA, or Chartered Financial Analyst. It is one of the most difficult to earn designations in the world, and one of the most highly regarded designations. So typically, I could be wrong on this, but I think you need at least 2 years of experience as a financial analyst to even earn the designation. So it's similar to a CPA or a CMA that we'll talk about in a little bit, in the fact that there's an education requirement, there's an exam requirement, there's a continuing education requirement, and an experience requirement. So chartered financial analysts tend to work on Wall Street, or again, for publicly traded companies, and they certainly command probably 25 to 50% more in salary once you've earned that designation. So that is something to think about. All right, so controllers and treasurers. I feel like controller is a pretty common role that many people have heard of. Some companies use comptroller and controller sort of interchangeably. They have a lot of the same sort of responsibilities. So the controller is typically the manager of the entire accounting team, and they typically report to a CFO. So again, in a small company, the CFO may perform the controller duties, or maybe the controller is sort of the highest finance function in the company because the company isn't large enough to warrant a CFO. Not only are they responsible for the accurate and timely creation of all of the monthly financial reporting, but they'd also be responsible for compliance functions. So depending on the industry, there may be, certain things that need to get done. For example, like in insurance, there's a lot more reporting that's required because of issues that various insurance companies have had in the past where they've gone bankrupt, or in a transportation company, you might have to report certain figures to the Department of Transportation on a regular basis. So the controller would also be responsible for that. Controllers work really closely with CPAs and the financial analysis team if there is a separate one. So the controller would put together the financial reporting. They would provide it to the CPAs to perform their audits or do the tax returns, whatever that may be. So the controller sometimes serves as the treasurer as well, and vice versa. So this is one where, it's sort of convoluted as to what they're responsible for. But typically, when there is a separate treasurer function, that treasurer would focus on really relationships with various stakeholders of the business. So it could be investors, could be banks, it could be other third-party lenders, could be even vendor relationships sometimes, or they might work really closely with the sales team. Cash flow and solvency are really the key areas that a treasurer would be focused on. again, if these roles were separated within a company, but I certainly would not assume that a smaller medium-sized business would need both of these roles. They can, sort of become one and the same. They both start, or I guess not start, you need to have quite a bit of experience to hold either of these positions, but their median salary in the US is about $220,000 for these roles. So again, definitely as a small, medium-sized business owner, you're not going to have two of these. You may just have a controller that does everything. And of course, that $220,000 medium pay, that includes businesses of all sizes. So obviously being a controller of a multinational publicly traded company is probably going to be a little more intense than being the controller of a local business that does 10 or 20 million a year in revenue, which obviously makes sense. What's up next? CMAs. So this is a designation that I earned recently. So definitely happy to field any specific questions on this designation. It was fun to earn. I learned a lot, even after having 20 years of experience. So definitely a valuable exercise. So the requirements are pretty different from a CPA, but I think it's more because the focus is different. The CMA is offered through the Institute of Management Accountants. The requirements for earning the CMA are uniform worldwide. So there are tons of international candidates for the CMA, and they take the same exams across the world. And it's really people who want to earn their CMA are serving sort of in a more advisory role within the business. So it's focused on both finance and accounting, but definitely for sort of manager or executive level folks. There's a huge focus on ethics, leadership, decision making throughout the curriculum. So there is an experience requirement that you have to have before you can earn your license. So, as with the CPA or the CFA, there's the exams that you have to take, an education requirement, being you have to have a bachelor's or a secondary, whichever that is, plus a work experience requirement, plus the continuing ed requirement. So they're definitely large undertakings. But a CMA would work within, the same sort of rules and guidelines that a CPA would. They are using GAAP or IFRS as their guidelines. But instead of focusing on, some of the tax pieces that we'll talk about in a minute, they're focused again on sort of long-term business strategy, profitability, new product offerings, expansions, acquisitions, things like that. So really a CMA can hold any role within the company, similar to a CPA or a CFA, but typically a CMA would earn 10 to 20% more than someone in the same role without that designation. So we will jump right into CPAs on the back of the CMA info. So a CPA is earned through the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. The big difference here is that from state to state, these certification requirements vary a lot. So in some states, it is extremely difficult to earn a CPA. The exams themselves are difficult. But then also some states require 5 years of experience reporting directly to someone who holds their CPA, where other states may have no requirement for that. So it's very interesting how much it varies. But definitely, I've known people from school or throughout my career that have moved to certain states just to earn their CPA in that particular state. So, that's sort of an interesting aspect of earning your CPA. They typically will focus on audits. as we discussed earlier, tax, whether it be tax strategy or, actually compiling tax returns. Uh, a lot of CPA firms offer consulting now. So, they'll weigh in on acquisitions and what the, business and tax impacts of those might be. Um, it sort of sky's the limit now, especially with the big four CPA firms. They offer just about everything. Uh, and then the one that I have always found the most interesting that many CPAs get involved with is forensic accounting. So, forensic accounting, a lot of times is like court ordered. So as a business owner, you never, I guess, want to have a forensic accountant coming in because that means you've probably done something wrong. So, I'm sure everyone who's listening to this has heard of things like Enron or, fraudulent activities that have happened related to accounting for 401k plans or whatever it may be, and that's sort of when forensic accountants get involved to try and sort of unwind all of those things that may have happened and determine who is committing the fraud and who's to blame and who should be held accountable. So that's something I've always found fascinating. Maybe I'll go back to school and get into that if I'm feeling motivated. So finally, we will talk about the role of a CFO. So again, CFO's a title that everybody probably knows. They oversee all the financial functions within a company. So if you have a small company that has a CFO, they might literally perform the tasks of all 10 of the roles that we discussed today. Or if it's a bigger company, they are, overseeing all of these various departments related to accounting and finance. So, they're responsible for the investments in capital structure, accounting, analysis, treasury, you name it. They're typically focused on the high level financial goals of the company. So they're sort of the second ranking executive behind the CEO. So, the two go hand in hand, and there are a lot of, jokes about how the CEO and the CFO's personality are typically opposite, but, the best parts of each come together to make a successful company. So, the CFO is ultimately responsible for every financial aspect of the company. They're typically an officer, well, obviously with the chief financial officer title. They are an officer of the company. So, they're personally liable a lot of the time for what goes on within the company. So they definitely can't, sort of put their heads in the sand and pretend that they don't know what's going on. And, with that level of responsibility, the average salary that a CFO, or the median salary, sorry, that a CFO makes in this country is about $400,000 a year. So, nothing to sneeze at. Oh, I forgot to mention, so with CPAs, they're typically billing out with the, let's say you have a local CPA firm, they bill by the hour, always similar to like a lawyer. And it's typically between like $200 and $400 an hour that they bill out. So, they're highly educated, they work really hard, and they're paid accordingly. So definitely a good path to go down if that's something you're considering. But again, from perspective of the small business owner, you probably don't want to have your CPA doing very basic bookkeeping for you, because you can find somebody that's more cost effective to do that. So just something to keep in mind as the business owner. And that brings us to the question portion, if anybody has any.
Well, Jessica, I know that I have a couple of questions.
Great.
As a new small business owner, and this is a loaded question because Jessica actually is my CMA. I was looking for a bookkeeper, but ended up with a CMA. What's your opinion for new business owners? Should they start with the CMA designation so that person can help them get going and then move to a bookkeeper, or vice versa?
So I would say vice versa, only because typically in the very beginning stages of starting a business, like you might want to hire a CMA maybe for on sort of like a project basis to help you develop your budget if you're putting together a business plan to try and get investors or approach banks. You would definitely want somebody with some more experience to help you with that, right? Sort of putting together a budget that makes sense and is realistic. A bookkeeper may not be able to help you with that. But a lot of CMAs you can hire on that project basis. So I think I would probably start with a bookkeeper and then maybe only reach out to the CMA about particular items that the bookkeeper maybe can't handle or are, sort of out of scope for them.
Good answer. Thank you. My second question, as we wait for other people in the audience to ask questions, is CFO is personally responsible for the company. Wow, I had no idea, first of all. Second of all, I think a lot of companies use this title with less thought than they should. And if a company, how companies are usually structured with CEOs, COOs, CFOs, is it, if your company's not really big enough for a $400,000 personally responsible CFO, and you have an accountant or a CPA that kind of looks over the higher level stuff, would a company having a CMA be a good alternative, or is there something that a company should be thinking about as far as the CFO and how that relates back and forth, assuming that you have staff accountants and bookkeepers and all of that?
Yeah, so it's funny that you say that companies use this title with less thought than they should. I couldn't agree with you more. I have found since starting my company and offering these fractional, my fractional services company offers bookkeeping, controllership, even CFO services. It's sort of the full range there, but we charge different rates accordingly, obviously, for those different needs. But what I found when I started offering these services is that there are a lot of small businesses that will say, oh, here's my CFO, but truly that person is not performing, I guess, quote unquote, real CFO duties,
Mm.
right? So they're really performing more of the role of a controller or even an accounting manager, but because they're the highest ranking person in the company, or in the finance side of the company, they're given that CFO title.
Right.
I don't think that's necessary. I've always thought it was kind of silly for, in my opinion, if you're doing less than, 10, even $15 million a year in revenue, you don't really need a CFO, right? The CFO can sort of serve that purpose, or maybe even the treasurer. So, the CFO title having officer in it, a lot of people who have the CFO title for these small companies aren't legally officers
Right.
of the company.
Right.
So that's sort of where that disconnect gets, right? Like, so, you could call me the CFO of your company that I work with you on, but that doesn't mean I have signing authority for checks or that I'm listed with the state as a responsible party. So, there are definitely some like legal parts of it that need to be worked out. So, that sort of high CFO pay is directly related to that personal responsibility. So if I'm listed with the state or the federal government as an officer of the company and I'm signing, for new loans on behalf of the company and these sort of things, like that's why the pay would be so high.
And that makes a lot of sense. Like the officer, that true officer of a corporation designation is really what's in that title and what's associated with that personal liability and everything, not necessarily chief financial person, CFP.
Right, exactly. So like that's why I tend to tell people to use the controller title,
Control.
because you don't have that, like the controller has a lot of responsibility, but they don't have sort of that
So,
ability to run out and open a new bank account on the business's behalf,
yeah,
or you
that,
know.
to me, that really just cleared it up in my mind
Oh,
because it's
good.
a little confusing. So that's great. We have another question. When looking for someone to help with bookkeeping or financials in a company, would you suggest, where would you suggest looking? And would you suggest looking for someone to contract or someone to hire, or would that be dependent on the business?
Great question. So it's definitely dependent on need. I think most so let's say an owner is doing the bookkeeping themselves, which again, it's super, super common, and especially when a business first opens. So in that case, you might want to start with somebody contract, and then sort of determine, do I need a full-time person for this? And as the business grows, you likely will need to hire a true employee that works full time for the company. But there are lots and lots of options for both contractors and for employees. So, for employees, you're going to take the same sort of route that you would when you're recruiting any role. I will say right now, just like for any role out there, accounting or otherwise, it is extremely difficult to find full-time help right now. So sometimes that contract work is the only way you can go. Um, but in terms of that contracting, like Google is a really good. Well, so hold on, let me take a step back. Your first place you should look for either contract or for employees is through your network, because just like any other role, and especially contract or consulting roles, you never know sort of what you're getting, right? It can be really hard to determine from one interview or two interviews sort of what somebody's skill set is. So I always recommend going to your network of friends or colleagues or other business owners that you know or work with, and asking them for their recommendation. That should always be the first step. If you can't find anybody that way, and honestly, I think that method would turn up somebody 90-95% of the time, honestly. But if that doesn't work, just like a Google search of bookkeeping, gosh, it'll turn up 30 or 40 bookkeeping firms just within probably a 50-mile radius. Never mind nationally. There are just tons and tons out there. I think the challenge is just, sort of comparison shopping on price, what their capacity is, and really just finding out if they're people that sort of gel with your culture. Because even if they are contract, they're still going to have to work with everybody else in your business. So, but yeah, there are tons and tons of options out there, which is helpful.
Awesome. Any other questions? I'll keep an eye on that as I and I'll circle back if somebody has any, but right now we don't have any more. But wanted to thank you, Jessica. Appreciate it. This was very informative for me, and I'm sure it's very informative for everybody who is on. Just so everybody knows, we have recorded this program today, and that the links will be available to you shortly with our, we always write a little blog about this, and it will be on our website at morganfranklinfellowship.com. And as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, MFF helps you learn how to talk about money and to understand how money works in the real world. Our signature program, Standards of Financial Literacy, has helped hundreds to learn the concepts and the rules and the vocabulary of money and finance and banking. So today's concepts and rules and vocabulary on these different pieces of finance industry is really helpful for me. Our curriculum for the Standards of Financial Literacy was based on and adapted from the National Standards of Financial Literacy, which was developed from the Council of Economics of Education. And the curriculum is free to both individuals and organizations who want to learn and teach about financial literacy. If you go through this program, you will become an MFF fellow, as we call you. And MFF fellows have access to additional courses, the opportunities for mentoring, the opportunities for networking, internships, and participating in real world projects. So we're always looking for great fellows who want to take that next step and move forward. These opportunities will help support you as you continue your journey on your personal financial successes. To learn more, please visit our website at morganfranklinfellowship.com. And of course, to follow us on our blogs and our social media, learn about more in upcoming events, read about our fellow successes, which is always interesting for me. I love seeing the different ways fellows incorporate the learning aspects of our curriculum in their real world, and how they have reached out to us for various different ways that they can use it. Thank you, Jessica. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I very much enjoyed it. And my email address is on that last slide. So, if anyone in the future has any questions, if they're watching the recording, or, if anyone thinks of questions later, you can feel free to email me.
Wonderful. Thank
Great.
you very much. We
Thanks.
appreciate your help.